So, moving on, we're going to take a break and look at the video that's on right. So, pause this, go to the Prezi, open the link, and it'll talk about these two frescoes, which are essentially the effects of good and bad government, which we'll talk about in a second. Pause video now. And I'm back. You should have just watched the video while you were on hold. Now, just looking at this, we're seeing a lot of negative imagery of tyrannical government. You see famine, murder, scorched earth, fires, uh, things just really going to hell in a handbasket, as people used to say, probably not anymore. Anyway, and here we have more of a Republican government. Everything's coming up roses. People are cooperating. Things are all groovy in this world. All right. Moving on. As we get into the end of the Italian Renaissance and the beginning, into really the throes of the Reformation, Counter Reformation period, Catholics versus Protestants, who's going to take the power and who's going to get which territories. All of this is happening now. This is what you're seeing is the devil playing a monk, like a musical instrument. Some people say that it's Martin Luther, but that isn't really the case. This is really kind of playing into the ideas of Protestants and anti Catholicism. Each little inscription down here would have been printed or written something completely different, usually with some sort of anti Catholic sentiment. Now, this is a woodcut with, it looks like this has been colored in with some sort of water-based paint, and then the print on top of it. It could be a multi-layer print. There are many different editions of this. A lot of them are just black and white. So getting the color version is rare and really quite beautiful. But here we're seeing with technological advances of mechanized type and mass production of imagery. Not everything's written out like an illuminated manuscript, like we saw in the Byzantine and things like that. So what we're seeing is something that looks a little bit more familiar to us when we think of propaganda. You think of like the posters from World War I and things like that, and beyond the posters and the advertisements. This very much has that look. And getting back into editorial cartoons, here is a piece attributed to Benjamin Franklin: "Join or Die." So this is actually this was associated with the American Revolution and trying to unite all of the colonies. But it was really first introduced during the 7 Years' War, to unite the colonies against the French and the Indian allies. Uh, so here it is, like, something that is Britain and colonists uniting against a cause that then gets reinterpreted over, against the British just a few years later. So it's really kind of cool how to see these images get reappropriated and these same concepts get, flipped on their head and, used against the powers that once supported them. It's a really interesting power flip that we see. Now, this is really just the snake cut into 8 sections. that New England, instead of showing each one of them as an individual state, it is very much just one big lump, and that is thought just to be for the sake of looks. That it might have been too busy, or it might have been more too small to do an effective wood cutting with. Um, Especially since that isn't really Franklin's forte, that he was more of a silversmith and engraver of metals and not wood. So there are a few different ideas about why that is, but this is the way it looks. This is what we're familiar with. Now, in World War I, we really see, war propaganda just ramp up into what I think is the golden age. And you see these wonderful posters with these, bold type, strong imagery, and all of these just all of this wonderful, uh, symbolism, all just trying to win over the person who sees it. And it's this great period of propaganda that we're going to get into with the next part of these lessons. But here is probably the first and most famous one. Britons want Lord Kitchener wants you to join your country's army. God save the king. Lord Kitchener was a famous um, military general for Her Majesty's service. Now, he rose through the ranks. He's got the story. He worked hard. He went all the way up to the top. And at the start of World War I, he was the Secretary of War. Now, you're looking at this and thinking, well, gee, Mr. King, that looks kind of familiar. Well, you're right, because that was then appropriated for, hey, Uncle Sam wants you. And we've seen this, used in 100 different contexts. But we're really looking at these personifications of the country. And it's this kind of cool thing. Lord Kitchener was the the hardworking person who sacrificed everything for his country. Uncle Sam is he's the old, wizened but stern figure of America, needing you to help out and pitch in. Whereas we also have Columbia, who was mentioned briefly in the Howard Zinn lecture that you listened to earlier in the semester. And here she is, being more of a mother figure to uh, to Americans, that she's, welcoming all of you with open arms, to, you know, to fall into her, that she's going to protect you and kind of fill uh, this motherly role. And then, just for kicks, actually, before we talk about that, she let's talk about Columbia. One last thing I forgot to mention. She's fairly been supplanted with the idea of the Statue of Liberty. So the Statue of Liberty has kind of replaced Columbia in our pop culture. And you think about even Columbia Pictures, the movie company, that Columbia in the intro, she's holding a torch. So she's kind of a mix between this Columbia and the Statue of Liberty. That's a little side note, but here we see a lesser known personification called Brother Jonathan, who was kind of like a Yankee, kind of a dastardly ne'er-do-well version of a Northerner, but in all the ways that is kind of the idealized and not in the negative sense. he started out as a personification of the United States and was always projected that way, but he was more commonly associated with Northern beliefs. And here we have the Pope coming over to the United States and, trying to, hey, wait, come back. My friend, we have concluded to take charge of your spiritual welfare and your temporal estate so that we need not be troubled to serve in the future. We will say your prayers and spend your money while you live. This is all about anti-Catholic sentiment, which was huge for a long time. People didn't like the Catholic Church. And even, John F. Kennedy, when he was running for president into the 60s, this persisted that one of the biggest knocks on him running was that he was a Catholic. And, it's amazing how these stereotypes and prejudices continue on from generation to generation. So here we have Brother Jonathan on the left whittling away at a stick, and he's like, "No, you don't, Mr. Pope. You're all together." What does that even say? Toe willing, but you can't put the mark of the beast on Americans. So anyway, there you go. And that is going to conclude the first installment of Propaganda. And that kind of walks us through the history of it. And we're going to pick up at World War I with the next video series. I hope that you enjoyed. Peace.